Something extraordinary happened on February 20th, 2025 that completely rewrote the rules of international tourism. After keeping its borders sealed for over 5 years, North Korea suddenly cracked open its doors to Western visitors for exactly 96 hours. Only 13 people from 9 different countries were allowed inside, and what they discovered during those 4 days has sparked a global conversation about the world's most secretive nation. Then, just as suddenly as it began, North Korea slammed the door shut again with no explanation. The brief experiment left more questions than answers about what the regime was actually testing during those critical 4 days. The 96-hour window that changed everything. The details of what actually happened during those 4 days reveal why North Korean authorities reacted so drastically. This wasn't just any ordinary tourism announcement. North Korea had maintained absolute isolation from Western visitors since January 21st, 2020, when they became the first country on Earth to completely seal their borders at the pandemic's onset. For over 5 years, not a single Western tourist had set foot inside the Hermit Kingdom. The regime had turned their already extreme isolationism into something unprecedented in modern history. Then suddenly, without warning or explanation, North Korean authorities contacted a single Chinese tour operator on February 15, 2025. The message was simple but shocking. They would accept exactly 13 Western tourists for a 4-day visit to Rason City starting February 20th. The group had to be assembled within 5 days, cross overland from China, and agree to restrictions that made previous North Korean tours look relaxed. The selected 13 came from 9 different countries, 1 each from United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Greece. Notably absent were Americans, who faced an outright ban that North Korean officials refused to explain. The tourists surrendered passports, underwent checks, and provided devices for inspection, illustrating the regime's reliance on old-school controls and their agreement to strict local rules. Rason City itself represented a calculated choice by North Korean authorities. Located in the country's far northeast corner, it sits at the exact tripoint where North Korea meets Russia and China. The city operates as a special economic zone, designed specifically for foreign interaction, and therefore already equipped with the infrastructure needed to monitor and control outside visitors. More importantly, Rason's isolation from the rest of North Korea meant tourists would see only what authorities wanted them to see. The visitors faced restrictions that went far beyond typical guided tours. They couldn't leave their designated hotel after sunset, required escorts for every movement outside their rooms, and had to submit all electronic devices for inspection twice daily. North Korean guides accompanied them to bathroom breaks, monitored their conversations with local staff, and confiscated any items they deemed inappropriate, including books, magazines, and certain clothing items. But something went wrong with North Korea's carefully planned experiment. On March 8th, just 16 days after the last tourist departed, Pyongyang issued a terse statement through their state news agency announcing the immediate suspension of all Western tourism indefinitely. No explanation accompanied the announcement. No timeline was provided for future reconsideration. The brief window that had taken 5 years to open slammed shut faster than anyone expected. What happened during those 96 hours that spooked North Korean authorities so badly? The answer lies in what the 13 visitors documented and shared with the world afterward. Every single tourist posted content about their experience across social media platforms. Their combined videos, photos, and written accounts have generated over 15 million views on YouTube alone, with millions more across Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The content these tourists produced differed dramatically from previous North Korean travel documentation. Armed with 2025 smartphone technology, they captured details that previous visitors with older equipment had missed. Their videos showed infrastructure decay that North Korean authorities hadn't anticipated would be visible. They documented interactions with local residents that revealed more about daily life than the regime intended. Most concerning for Pyongyang, they recorded conversations that suggested North Koreans were far more aware of outside world events than the government wanted known. One British tourist video showing empty store shelves in what was supposed to be Rasan's most prosperous district gained 2.3 million views within the first week. An Australian visitor's documentation of crumbling apartment buildings visible from their hotel window accumulated 1.8 million views. A German tourists' recording of local residents quietly asking about news from Europe reached 1.2 million viewers before North Korean authorities likely became aware of its existence. The regime's traditional methods for controlling information had assumed tourists would share their experiences through limited channels like personal blogs or small travel communities. Instead, social media algorithms pushed North Korean content to massive global audiences hungry for rare glimpses inside the Hermit Kingdom. Videos that might have reached hundreds of people 5 years ago were now reaching millions within days. North Korean officials had also underestimated how modern technology would enable real-time documentation. Previous tourists had to wait until after their visits to process and share content. The 2025 visitors were uploading videos, photos, and commentary while still inside North Korea, using cellular data that somehow remained accessible despite the country's internet restrictions. This real-time sharing meant North Korean authorities lost control of the narrative before they realized what was happening. The most revealing aspect of the tourist content wasn't what it showed about North Korea's physical infrastructure, but what it revealed about the regime's outdated understanding of information control in the digital age. Their guides repeatedly tried to restrict photography and recording using methods that had worked in 2019 but proved completely ineffective against 2025 technology and social media platforms. The economic implications of this failed experiment extend far beyond tourism revenue. North Korea had invested enormous resources preparing for the visit, including renovating facilities, training specialized guides, and coordinating security measures across multiple government agencies. The abrupt cancellation represented not just lost tourism income, but wasted preparation costs and damaged credibility with potential future visitors. More significantly, the experiment exposed fundamental contradictions in North Korea's current strategy. The regime desperately needs foreign currency from tourism, but their control mechanisms haven't evolved to handle modern information technology. They want the economic benefits of international engagement while maintaining absolute control over information flow, a combination that the February experiment proved impossible to achieve. The 13 tourists also documented something else that likely concerned North Korean authorities: evidence of the country's military preparations that weren't supposed to be visible to civilian visitors. Several videos inadvertently captured military vehicles, construction projects near the border, and infrastructure that suggested far more military activity in the region than North Korea wanted revealed to Western observers. The global attention generated by the February visitors has created a new problem for North Korea. The millions of people who viewed their content are now actively searching for any new information about the country. This sustained international interest means that future tourism experiments will face even more scrutiny and documentation than the February group encountered. The failed Western tourism experiment left North Korean authorities with a clear lesson about the impossibility of controlling modern information flows. But while they slammed the door on Western visitors, they had already opened it to another group entirely, one that would prove equally disappointing in completely different ways: Russia's exclusive access and disappointing numbers. Since February 2024, Russians have held an exclusive privilege that no other nationality possesses: unrestricted access to North Korea as tourists. This represents the first time in over 5 years that any foreign citizens have been welcome to visit the Hermit Kingdom for leisure purposes. The policy shift directly reflects the strengthening strategic partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, particularly as both countries find themselves increasingly isolated from Western nations due to the ongoing Ukraine conflict. Russian tourists can now book trips to North Korea through specialized tour operators in Vladivostok, cross the border at Tumangang, and visit destinations that have remained completely off limits to everyone else since January 2020. The numbers tell a surprising story that North Korean officials likely didn't anticipate. Throughout the entire year of 2024, fewer than 880 Russian citizens actually chose to visit North Korea despite having completely open access that other nationalities would pay enormous sums to obtain. This figure becomes even more striking when compared to North Korea's tourism peak in 2019, when approximately 350,000 Chinese visitors generated substantial revenue for the regime. The contrast reveals that political alliance doesn't automatically translate into tourism success, and that North Korea's expectations for Russian visitor numbers may have been wildly optimistic. The geopolitical reasons behind Russia's privileged status stem directly from North Korea's military support for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Kim Jong-un's regime has provided artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and even deployed troops to support Russian forces, creating a level of military cooperation not seen since the Korean War era. This partnership has made Russia North Korea's most important ally, surpassing even China in terms of immediate strategic value. Tourism privileges represent just one small benefit of this broader military and economic relationship that has fundamentally reshaped North Korea's international positioning. Russian tourists don't enjoy the freedom that their exclusive access might suggest. They still face the same restrictive conditions that characterized pre-pandemic North Korean tourism. Mandatory guided tours, predetermined itineraries, constant supervision by government-appointed minders, and prohibition from independent exploration. Russian visitors must stay in designated hotels, eat at approved restaurants, and follow routes that have been carefully planned to show only what North Korean authorities want them to see. Photography restrictions remain in place, conversations with local citizens are monitored, and any deviation from the planned schedule results in immediate intervention by security personnel. The locations available to Russian tourists are limited to the same sanitized circuits that previous foreign visitors experienced. Pyongyang remains the primary destination, with its showcase monuments, museums, and carefully maintained facades designed to impress outsiders. The demilitarized zone tour continues to operate for Russians, allowing them to visit Panmunjom and experience the heavily scripted presentation about the Korean War and ongoing tensions with South Korea. Some Russian groups have also been permitted to visit Mount Pektu near the Chinese border, though access depends on weather conditions and political considerations that can change without notice. Several factors explain why Russian tourism numbers remain disappointingly low despite the exclusive access. Language barriers create significant obstacles for Russian visitors, as most North Korean guides speak limited Russian, and communication difficulties reduce the overall experience quality. Cultural differences also play a role, as Russian tourists often have different expectations and interests compared to the Chinese visitors who previously dominated North Korean tourism. The lack of familiar amenities, entertainment options, and dining choices that appeal to Russian tastes makes North Korea a less attractive destination compared to other Asian countries that actively court Russian tourism. Economic factors within Russia itself have also dampened tourism demand. International sanctions and the costs associated with the Ukraine war have reduced disposable income for many Russian citizens, making expensive international travel less accessible. North Korean tours typically cost between $2,000 and $4,000 per person for a week-long visit, representing a significant expense for middle-class Russian families already dealing with economic pressures from the ongoing conflict and sanctions regime. The logistics of reaching North Korea present additional challenges for potential Russian visitors. Most Russians must travel to Vladivostok first, then cross overland into North Korea through the single functioning border crossing. This journey can take several days each way, adding time and expense that make the overall trip less appealing compared to more accessible destinations. Flight connections between Russian cities and Vladivostok are limited and expensive, particularly for Russians living in European parts of the country. North Korea's tourism revenue from Russian visitors generates less than $2 million annually, a figure that falls far short of what the regime likely hoped to achieve when they opened the border to Russian tourists. This amount represents a tiny fraction of the revenue that Chinese tourism once provided, when peak years generated over $175 million for the North Korean economy. The disappointing financial returns from Russian tourism highlight the challenges facing North Korea's attempts to replace Chinese visitors with alternative sources of tourism income. The broader economic context makes these low tourism revenues even more significant. North Korea has earned an estimated $5.5 billion from arms sales and military cooperation with Russia since 2023, making tourism income essentially irrelevant to the regime's overall financial strategy. Military cooperation with Russia generates approximately 2,750 times more revenue than Russian tourism, fundamentally altering North Korea's economic priorities and reducing the incentive to invest heavily in tourism infrastructure or marketing efforts targeting Russian visitors. This economic shift represents a fundamental change in North Korea's relationship with foreign tourism. Previously, tourism served as one of the few legal sources of foreign currency available to the regime under international sanctions. The massive revenue from military cooperation with Russia has essentially eliminated tourism's economic importance, allowing the regime to maintain restrictive policies without worrying about lost tourism income. Current trends suggest that Russian tourism to North Korea will likely remain at low levels throughout 2025 and beyond. The structural factors that limit Russian interest haven't changed, and the regime's focus on military cooperation means tourism development remains a low priority. Yet despite these disappointing visitor numbers and minimal revenue, North Korea has been quietly pursuing a completely different strategy that defies conventional economic logic. The billion-dollar tourism infrastructure sitting empty. The regime has been constructing what amounts to a tourism empire designed for visitors who aren't allowed to come. Since 2014, Kim Jong-un's government has invested an estimated $7.8 billion in tourism projects across the country, about a quarter of North Korea's GDP. These massive expenditures have continued throughout the pandemic isolation period, creating a surreal situation where luxury resort complexes stand completely empty, while construction crews add finishing touches to facilities that may never see their intended guests. The crown jewel of this construction boom is the Wonsan Beach Resort, a project so enormous it defies easy description. The complex stretches along 5 kilometers of North Korea's eastern coastline, featuring more than 150 separate hotel buildings, restaurants, entertainment venues, and recreational facilities. Satellite imagery reveals high-rise accommodation towers, sprawling conference centers, and what appears to be one of the largest water park facilities in Northeast Asia. The resort's architects designed it to accommodate tens of thousands of simultaneous visitors, making it one of the largest beach resort complexes built by a single regime. Construction teams initially targeted a 2019 opening date for Wonsan, but delays pushed the completion timeline back repeatedly. The most recent official announcements from North Korean state media indicate a planned opening for June 2025, though no tourists beyond Russians are currently permitted to enter the country. The resort features architectural elements clearly designed to appeal to international visitors, including Western-style hotel layouts, international cuisine restaurants, and recreational facilities that mirror those found at major resort destinations worldwide. The Samjian ski resort near the Chinese border represents another massive investment in tourism infrastructure that currently serves virtually no visitors. This mountain resort complex includes multiple ski slopes, a dedicated airport capable of handling international flights, and a specialized train station connected directly to Pyongyang via high-speed rail. Construction crews have also built luxury vacation condominiums in the surrounding area, with satellite imagery from 2022 showing ongoing development of additional residential buildings intended for wealthy international tourists seeking extended stays. North Korean authorities have invested heavily in supporting infrastructure for these tourism projects. New roads connect both Wonsan and Samjian to major transportation hubs, including upgraded highways that can handle large tour buses and private vehicles. The government has constructed additional airport terminals, expanded port facilities at Wonsan for potential cruise ship visitors, and built specialized border crossing facilities designed to process large numbers of international tourists efficiently. The economic pressure created by these empty facilities grows more intense with each passing month. Maintenance costs for the Wonsan-Kalma Beach Resort alone likely exceed $10 million annually, covering everything from climate control systems running in unoccupied buildings to security personnel protecting empty facilities from potential vandalism or weather damage. The Samjian Ski Resort requires similar ongoing expenses, including snowmaking equipment operation, lift maintenance, and facility upkeep throughout the harsh winter months when no tourists arrive to generate revenue. Satellite analysis reveals continuing construction activity at both major resort complexes throughout 2024 and into 2025, despite the absence of any clear timeline for reopening to international tourists. Work crews have been observed installing final interior elements, testing mechanical systems, and conducting what appears to be full operational rehearsals with North Korean staff playing the roles of international guests. These activities suggest the regime maintains serious expectations that tourism will resume at some point, justifying the continued investment in completion and maintenance of these massive projects. The financial sustainability of these developments becomes increasingly questionable as isolation policies continue. Standard hospitality industry calculations suggest that resort complexes of this size require minimum occupancy rates of 60 to 70% to break even on operational costs, excluding the massive construction investments already made. With current Russian tourism numbers below 900 visitors annually, the combined capacity of North Korea's new tourism infrastructure could accommodate the current visitor volume for multiple years without approaching profitable occupancy levels. International sanctions have complicated the completion of these tourism projects in ways that may affect their eventual operation. Reports indicate that finishing materials for interior construction have been difficult to obtain, potentially leaving some facilities incomplete despite their outward appearance of readiness. No interior photographs of either the Wonsan-Kalma Beach Resort or Samjian Ski Resort have ever appeared in North Korean state media, raising questions about whether the impressive exterior facades conceal unfinished or substandard interior conditions. The regime's continued investment in tourism infrastructure during a period of complete isolation suggests a long-term strategic vision that extends beyond current geopolitical circumstances. North Korean planners appear to anticipate eventual normalization of international relations that would allow unrestricted tourism development. The scale and sophistication of current projects indicate expectations that future tourism could reach levels far exceeding historical peaks, potentially targeting wealthy international visitors willing to pay premium prices for exclusive access to previously forbidden destinations. The economic mathematics of North Korea's tourism infrastructure development creates a compelling argument for eventual reopening policies. With billions invested in facilities that generate no current revenue, the regime faces mounting pressure to justify these expenditures through actual tourism operations. The longer these complexes remain empty, the more difficult it becomes to rationalize their continued maintenance and the opportunity costs of resources that could have been allocated to other development priorities. Yet the February experiment with Western visitors may have revealed exactly why these elaborate facilities remain shuttered. The 13 tourists who briefly entered North Korea documented their experience in ways that apparently caught the regime completely off guard, producing content that would fundamentally what the February visitors actually revealed. The 13 Western visitors who entered North Korea in February 2025 produced content that fundamentally differed from anything previously documented about the Hermit Kingdom. Within hours of crossing back into China, videos began appearing on YouTube channels, including A.O. Solino, Tamil Trekker, Washtec, and Michael K., each offering unprecedented glimpses into North Korean daily life that previous tourists had never captured. These weren't the carefully staged presentations that characterized pre-2020 North Korean tourism content, but rather spontaneous documentation of a society that appeared far more aware of outside world events than the regime wanted revealed. The most striking revelation came from a British visitor's video showing the central market area in Rason City. unlike the bustling commercial districts that North Korean guides typically showcase. This footage revealed mostly empty vendor stalls with sparse product displays and limited customer activity. The video captured conversations between vendors in Korean that translation apps later revealed as discussions about Chinese goods becoming harder to obtain and prices rising for basic necessities. This type of economic insight had never appeared in previous tourist documentation because earlier visitors lacked the technology to translate overheard conversations in real time. An Australian tourist documentation of residential areas visible from their hotel window provided another revelation that concerned North Korean authorities. The footage showed apartment buildings with significant structural deterioration, including cracked facades, broken windows covered with plastic sheeting, and laundry hanging from improvised lines, suggesting inadequate indoor facilities. More concerning for the regime, the video captured residents watching what appeared to be foreign television programming through uncovered windows, contradicting official claims about information control in border regions. The technological capabilities of 2025 smartphones allowed these visitors to document details that would have been impossible to capture with earlier equipment. High-resolution cameras revealed text on signs and posters that could be translated later using image recognition software, exposing propaganda messages that differed from the official English translations provided by guides. GPS tracking automatically recorded precise locations and movement patterns, creating detailed maps of areas that North Korean authorities preferred to keep geographically vague for foreign visitors. Real-time translation apps created particularly problematic situations for North Korean information control. A German visitor's phone translated a conversation between their guide and a local official discussing instructions to avoid certain streets where military vehicles were parked. The most concerning documentation for authorities involved a visitor's video at the North Korea-Russia Friendship House in Rason, where the tourist filmed displays about bilateral cooperation while their guide became visibly uncomfortable discussing certain exhibits. The visitor's seemingly innocent comment about hoping for world peace in the facility's guest book prompted immediate intervention from officials, revealing how sensitive any references to current conflicts had become. The global reach of social media platforms amplified these revelations far beyond what North Korean authorities had anticipated. A single video showing empty store shelves that would have reached perhaps hundreds of viewers on a travel blog in 2019 instead gained 2.3 million views within 1 week on YouTube. Comment sections beneath these videos attracted additional attention, with viewers sharing their own analysis of visible details and comparing observations across different tourist videos to build more comprehensive pictures of conditions in Rason. North Korean guides appeared completely unprepared for the documentation capabilities that modern smartphones provided. Traditional restrictions like prohibiting photography in certain areas proved ineffective when tourists could record video discreetly while appearing to check messages or use other phone functions. Attempts to confiscate devices for inspection twice daily failed to prevent real-time uploading of content through cellular data connections that somehow remained accessible despite North Korea's internet restrictions. Several videos inadvertently captured military-related activities that became particularly sensitive given Rason's proximity to Rajan Port, located just 5 kilometers away, where North Korean troops reportedly load for deployment to Russia. Tourist footage showed military vehicles moving through Rason despite guides' assurances that the area was purely civilian. One visitor's video captured what appeared to be uniformed personnel boarding trains at Rason Station, contradicting official claims that no military operations occurred in the Special Economic Zone. Comments and reactions from millions of global viewers created additional problems for North Korean information control. Viewers used collective analysis to identify details that individual tourists might have missed, including license plate numbers on government vehicles, architectural features that suggested military purposes for certain buildings, and background conversations that translation software could process frame by frame. This crowdsourced analysis generated insights that traditional intelligence gathering methods might have required years to develop. The regime's traditional approach to managing tourist information involved controlling what visitors saw during their trips and limiting their ability to share detailed accounts afterward. The February 2025 experiment revealed that this strategy had become completely obsolete in the social media age. Tourists were now uploading content while still inside North Korea, sharing real-time observations that could be viewed by millions before North Korean authorities even realized the information had been recorded. The speed at which this content spread across social media platforms caught North Korean authorities completely off guard. Videos gained millions of views before government officials could assess their contents or determine appropriate responses. Traditional methods for containing information leaks assume days or weeks of processing time before content reached significant audiences. Instead, algorithms pushed North Korean tourism content to global audiences within hours of publication. Analysis of viewer comments revealed another dimension of the information control problem. International audiences were using the tourist videos to verify or contradict claims made in North Korean state media, creating real-time fact-checking that undermined official narratives. Viewers compared tourist footage with satellite imagery, previous documentation, and reports from defectors to build comprehensive assessments of conditions inside North Korea that surpassed anything available through traditional intelligence sources. The February visitors also documented aspects of daily life that revealed the regime's struggle to maintain ideological control in border regions. Their videos showed residents wearing clothing with foreign brand logos, using Chinese-made electronics, and displaying familiarity with outside world events that contradicted official isolation policies. These observations suggested that information control was breaking down in areas where foreign contact was necessary for economic activities. The global attention generated by these videos created sustained pressure for more transparency that North Korean authorities had not anticipated. Millions of viewers who had never previously shown interest in North Korean affairs were now actively seeking additional information about the country. This expanded audience meant that any future tourism experiments would face even more intensive documentation and analysis than the February group had provided. The technological revolution that enabled such comprehensive documentation represents a fundamental challenge to North Korea's information control strategy. Yet the regime's dramatic response to shut down Western tourism entirely suggests that maintaining secrecy has become more valuable than the revenue these visitors might generate. The economic calculations behind this decision reveal how dramatically North Korea's financial priorities have shifted in ways that make tourism income essentially meaningless. The Ukraine war's hidden impact on tourism policy. This economic transformation stems directly from North Korea's military involvement in the Ukraine conflict, which has fundamentally altered the regime's approach to international engagement. Since 2023, North Korea has earned an estimated $5.5 billion from arms sales to Russia, representing nearly one-fifth of the country's entire gross domestic product. This massive influx of military revenue has completely transformed Kim Jong-un's approach to international engagement, making the regime far less dependent on tourism income and therefore much more willing to maintain strict isolation policies that would have been economically devastating just a few years earlier. The scale of North Korea's military cooperation with Russia becomes clear when comparing war-related revenue to previous tourism earnings. At its peak in 2019, Chinese tourism generated approximately $175 million annually for North Korea, representing the largest source of foreign tourism revenue in the country's history. The current military partnership with Russia generates over 31 times more income than peak tourism years, fundamentally altering the economic incentives that previously encouraged North Korea to welcome foreign visitors despite security concerns. Beyond direct arms sales, North Korea has deployed thousands of soldiers to fight in Ukraine as state-sponsored mercenaries, creating an additional revenue stream estimated at $572 million annually. These troop deployments represent the first time North Korean forces have engaged in active combat operations outside the Korean peninsula since the Korean War, marking a dramatic escalation in the country's military involvement with Russia. The financial arrangement allows Russia to pay North Korea directly for military personnel, creating a steady income source that continues as long as the conflict persists. The deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine has created unprecedented secrecy requirements that directly impact tourism policy decisions. The regime faces the challenging task of hiding casualty figures from its own population while maintaining the fiction that North Korean soldiers are engaged in routine training exercises or construction projects rather than active combat operations. Intelligence estimates suggest that over 1,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, with more than 3,000 additional casualties requiring medical treatment and potential repatriation. These casualty figures represent a significant political risk for Kim Jong-un's government, which has never acknowledged that North Korean forces are fighting and dying in a foreign conflict. The regime's domestic propaganda continues to frame the Ukraine deployment as technical assistance and training cooperation rather than combat operations, requiring extensive information control measures to prevent the truth from reaching the North Korean population. Any leak of casualty information could undermine public support for the regime's foreign policy and create domestic pressure to withdraw from the conflict. Western tourists pose a particular information security risk regarding North Korea's Ukraine involvement because they cannot be controlled using the same methods applied to domestic populations. Unlike North Korean citizens who face severe punishment for accessing or sharing unauthorized information, Western visitors operate under different legal frameworks and possess technological capabilities that make information gathering and dissemination difficult to prevent. The February 2025 tourism experiment demonstrated that modern Western tourists could document and share information that contradicted official narratives within hours of their observations. The geographic proximity of military operations to tourist areas creates additional security concerns that complicate any future tourism reopening. The Rason Special Economic Zone, where the February 2025 Western visitors were permitted to travel, sits approximately 5 kilometers from the port facilities used to transport North Korean troops to Russia. This proximity means that tourists in the area could potentially observe military preparations, troop movements, or other activities related to the Ukraine deployment that North Korean authorities want to keep secret from international observers. Intelligence reports indicate that North Korean officials use the Rason port for loading military equipment and personnel onto ships bound for Russia, creating regular activity that would be difficult to completely hide from visitors staying in the area for multiple days. The February tourists were restricted to specific hotels and guided tours designed to avoid military-related areas. But their social media documentation revealed that they still observed more military activity than North Korean authorities had anticipated or wanted exposed to international audiences. The economic mathematics of North Korea's current situation make tourism revenue essentially negligible compared to war-related income. Military cooperation with Russia generates approximately 2,750 times more revenue than the disappointing Russian tourism numbers of fewer than 900 visitors annually. Even if North Korea could restore Chinese tourism to pre-pandemic levels of 350,000 visitors annually, the resulting income would represent less than 4% of current military revenue from Russia. This dramatic shift in economic priorities allows North Korea to maintain tourism restrictions without significant financial consequences. Previously, tourism served as one of the few legal sources of foreign currency available under international sanctions, making visitor revenue economically important despite security concerns. The massive income from military cooperation has eliminated tourism's economic necessity, giving the regime freedom to prioritize information control over revenue generation from foreign visitors. The war economy has also changed North Korea's international relationships in ways that affect tourism policy. The country's status as a major arms supplier to Russia has intensified Western sanctions and diplomatic isolation, making it politically risky to welcome visitors from countries that oppose the Ukraine invasion. Western tourists could potentially gather Intelligence about North Korean military capabilities, production facilities, or logistical operations that could be valuable to Ukrainian forces or NATO allies. The timing of the February 2025 tourism experiment's abrupt cancellation appears directly connected to escalating North Korean involvement in Ukraine. The decision to halt Western tourism came just weeks after intelligence reports confirmed increased North Korean troop deployments and casualties in the conflict. This timing suggests that military operations took precedence over any potential tourism revenue or diplomatic benefits from welcoming Western visitors. The fundamental transformation of North Korea's economy from tourism-dependent to war-dependent has created a new strategic framework that prioritizes military secrecy over economic development. Yet this economic shift coincided with another transformation that North Korean authorities had failed to anticipate: the evolution of digital technology and social media platforms during their 5 years of isolation had created an information environment completely different from the one they remembered. The social media revolution North Korea didn't expect. The platforms themselves had evolved into sophisticated content distribution systems that automatically promoted rare and exclusive material to maximize user engagement. YouTube alone had experienced a 35% increase in users since 2019, while advertising revenue on the platform had doubled, creating far stronger financial incentives for content creators to produce engaging videos about unique destinations. This growth meant that any content featuring rare access to North Korea would automatically receive algorithmic promotion to massive audiences hungry for exclusive glimpses into the world's most secretive nation. Every smartphone carried by the February 2025 visitors essentially functioned as a professional broadcasting studio capable of producing, editing, and distributing content that could reach millions of viewers within hours. The devices possessed recording capabilities that exceeded professional journalism equipment from just a few years earlier, including 4K video recording, advanced image stabilization, real-time translation features, and instant upload capabilities through cellular networks. North Korean authorities had not anticipated how these technological advances would enable tourists to document their experiences with unprecedented detail and immediacy. The contrast between pre-2020 and post-2020 content distribution reveals the magnitude of change that caught North Korean officials off guard. Previously, Western tourists who visited North Korea typically shared their experiences through personal travel blogs that reached perhaps hundreds or thousands of readers within specialized travel communities. These written accounts, often published weeks or months after visits, allowed North Korean authorities time to assess potential problems and develop appropriate responses. The limited reach of such content meant that even critical observations about North Korean society rarely gained significant international attention. The February 2025 visitors operated in a completely different media environment, where video content automatically received global distribution through recommendation algorithms designed to maximize engagement. A single video showing previously unseen aspects of North Korean life could gain hundreds of thousands of views within the first 24 hours of publication, reaching audiences that traditional travel writing could never access. This immediate and massive distribution eliminated the regime's traditional buffer period for managing information control and responding to potentially problematic revelations. The specific numbers from the February visitors' content demonstrate the scale of this information control challenge. Michael K's documentation reached an extraordinary 7.8 million views, representing a larger audience than most traditional media outlets achieve for their North Korea coverage. These massive view counts occurred despite the regime's attempts to restrict what tourists could film and share during their visit, revealing how completely ineffective traditional control methods had become in the social media age. TikTok and Instagram had emerged as additional platforms that North Korean authorities had not adequately considered in their information management planning. These platforms specialized in short-form content that could be produced and shared even more easily than traditional YouTube videos, often featuring trending hashtags that automatically distributed content to users interested in travel and international destinations. The visual nature of these platforms made them particularly problematic for North Korea, as even brief clips could reveal details about daily life, infrastructure conditions, or social dynamics that the regime preferred to keep hidden. The regime's traditional approach to controlling international media coverage had assumed they would deal primarily with professional journalists who could be identified, monitored, and restricted using established protocols. Professional journalists typically traveled with expensive equipment that was easy to detect and confiscate, worked for identifiable news organizations that could face diplomatic consequences for problematic coverage, and followed professional standards that made their reporting somewhat predictable. These journalists also usually required official accreditation and cooperation from North Korean authorities, giving the regime significant leverage over their coverage. Modern tourists with smartphones presented a completely different challenge that existing protocols could not address effectively. Every visitor possessed professional quality recording equipment that was indistinguishable from normal personal devices, made no formal commitments about their intended content creation, and operated through social media platforms that North Korean authorities could not influence or sanction. The tourists had no professional obligations to maintain diplomatic relationships or follow journalistic ethics, making their documentation far less predictable and controllable. The February experiment exposed fundamental flaws in North Korea's information management strategies that went beyond simple technological updates. The regime's approach assumed they could control what visitors saw during carefully planned tours and limit problematic documentation through device inspections and photography restrictions. However, modern smartphones enabled visitors to record continuously throughout their stay, capture audio conversations for later translation, and automatically upload content to cloud storage services that made confiscation ineffective. Real-time translation capabilities proved particularly problematic for North Korean information control efforts. Visitors could now understand conversations between guides and local officials that were never intended for foreign ears, translate signs and written materials that guides had misrepresented, and communicate directly with local residents without requiring official interpreters. These capabilities transform tourists from passive recipients of guided information into active investigators capable of independent fact-gathering. The algorithmic promotion systems used by major social media platforms created additional problems that North Korean authorities had not anticipated. Content featuring North Korea automatically received priority distribution because of high user engagement rates, meaning that videos documenting the February visit reached far larger audiences than their creators had expected. The platform's recommendation engines pushed North Korean content to users who had never shown previous interest in the country, expanding the audience for tourist documentation beyond traditional travel and political communities. The viral nature of social media content meant that individual videos could influence public perception of North Korea in ways that traditional media coverage never achieved. Comment sections beneath popular videos became forums for crowdsourced analysis, where viewers collaborated to identify details that individual tourists might have missed, creating collective intelligence that surpassed professional journalism in some respects. This collaborative analysis generated insights about North Korean society that would have required extensive intelligence operations to develop through conventional means. The speed at which content spread across multiple platforms simultaneously created information management challenges that existing North Korean protocols could not address. By the time officials became aware of problematic videos, they had already been viewed millions of times, downloaded by thousands of users, and redistributed across platforms that North Korean authorities could not access or influence. The global and instantaneous nature of social media distribution had made traditional information containment strategies completely obsolete. This technological revolution has created an impossible situation for North Korean leadership, where the very tools needed to document and promote tourism have become weapons that can undermine state control. The regime now confronts a fundamental dilemma that threatens to reshape their economic desperation versus information security. The billion-dollar question facing Kim Jong-un's regime centers on whether they can afford to keep their doors closed when their economy desperately needs every available source of foreign currency. International sanctions have systematically eliminated most traditional revenue sources, leaving tourism as one of the few remaining legal methods for earning hard currency from foreign visitors. The regime's economic planners understand that tourism could provide millions of dollars annually in foreign exchange, money that becomes increasingly vital as domestic economic conditions deteriorate and the costs of maintaining their massive military apparatus continue rising. The scale of North Korea's economic challenges becomes clear when examining the broader context of their financial situation. The government has prioritized military development over public welfare for decades, creating substantial economic inequalities that have strained civilian resources and impacted basic services like healthcare and food security. The COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing international sanctions have exacerbated these problems, creating conditions where every potential source of foreign currency becomes economically significant regardless of the political risks involved. Tourism infrastructure investments represent a particularly acute example of the regime's economic pressures. The Wonsan-Kalma Beach Resort alone requires over $10 million annually in maintenance costs, while the Samjian Ski Resort demands similar ongoing expenses for climate control, security, and facility upkeep. These empty facilities generate no revenue while consuming resources that could be allocated to other government priorities, creating mounting pressure to justify these investments through actual tourism operations that remain indefinitely postponed. The regime's internal discussions about tourism policy reveal fundamental disagreements between different government factions about how to balance economic needs against security concerns. Economic planners argue that foreign currency from tourism is essential for maintaining government operations and funding development projects, while security officials warn that foreign visitors pose unacceptable risks to information control and political stability. These competing priorities have created policy contradictions, where the regime simultaneously invests billions in tourism infrastructure while maintaining restrictions that prevent its use. The February 2025 experiment was specifically designed to test whether North Korea could implement controlled information flow that would allow limited tourism revenue without compromising security objectives. The regime selected Rason City precisely because its location near the Chinese border made it easier to control visitor movements while providing access to the special economic zone's existing tourism infrastructure. Officials planned strict parameters, including constant supervision, predetermined itineraries, and technology restrictions that they believed would prevent problematic information gathering or sharing. Multiple security measures were implemented during the February experiment that ultimately failed to contain information spread in ways that surprised North Korean authorities. Visitors were required to surrender their passports at the border and submit to extensive background checks. But these precautions proved ineffective against modern smartphone capabilities. Device inspections failed to prevent real-time content uploading through cellular networks that remained accessible despite internet restrictions. Mandatory escorts for all movements outside designated hotels could not prevent visitors from recording conversations and activities that contradicted official narratives. The most problematic security failure involved the regime's inability to control social media distribution of content created during the visit. Traditional restrictions on photography and recording proved completely inadequate against devices that could record continuously while appearing to perform other functions. Attempts to limit what visitors could document failed because modern smartphones enabled discrete recording that guides could not detect or prevent. The resulting videos gained millions of views before North Korean officials understood the scope of information that had been shared with global audiences. Economic opportunity costs of continued isolation have become increasingly difficult for the regime to justify internally. Tourism revenue that could generate tens of millions of dollars annually remains completely unrealized, while the costs of maintaining empty tourism facilities continue accumulating. The regime faces mounting pressure to utilize their massive infrastructure investments through actual tourism operations, but security concerns prevent the reopening that would make these facilities financially viable. The regime's economic calculus regarding tourism has fundamentally changed due to military cooperation, revenue from Russia. Arms sales and troop deployments generate an estimated $5.5 billion annually, representing 31 times more income than the $175 million that Chinese tourism once generated at its peak in 2019. This massive military revenue has reduced tourism's economic importance, allowing the regime to prioritize information security over tourism income without facing the severe financial consequences that would have been devastating just a few years earlier. Internal government factions continue debating tourism policy through different perspectives that reflect competing institutional priorities. Military officials argue that any foreign visitor access creates unacceptable intelligence risks, particularly given North Korea's involvement in Ukraine operations that require absolute secrecy. Economic planners counter that tourism revenue remains important for financing domestic development projects and maintaining infrastructure that could support future economic growth. Political officials worry that continued isolation will damage North Korea's international relationships and limit opportunities for diplomatic engagement. The fundamental dilemma facing North Korean tourism policy centers on the impossibility of controlling information flow in the modern digital age while still generating meaningful tourism revenue. The regime cannot restrict visitor technology and social media access to the extent necessary for information security without making the tourism experience so limited that few people would pay to participate. Conversely, allowing the access and freedom that tourists expect inevitably creates information control problems that threaten the regime's political stability. The February experiment demonstrated that North Korea's traditional information control methods cannot manage modern tourism in ways that would make reopening economically beneficial while maintaining political security. The regime now understands that any future tourism initiatives will face similar information control challenges that may be impossible to resolve using available technologies and restrictions. Yet the economic void created by their isolation extends far beyond the handful of Western visitors they briefly allowed, reaching into the massive tourist market that once formed the backbone of their entire tourism industry. China's missing tourists and the economic void. Chinese tourists represented the absolute foundation of North Korea's tourism economy before the pandemic, accounting for approximately 95% of all international visitors to the Hermit Kingdom. In 2019, about 350,000 Chinese visitors crossed the border compared to fewer than 5,000 non-Chinese tourists, demonstrating the overwhelming dominance of this single market. This wasn't simply a matter of geographic convenience or cultural similarity, but rather reflected a carefully constructed economic relationship that generated massive revenue for Kim Jong-un's regime while providing Chinese citizens with exclusive access to one of the world's most secretive destinations. The scale of Chinese tourism reached unprecedented levels that year, contributing an estimated $175 million to North Korea's economy through hotel stays, guided tours, shopping, and various tourist services. The economic structure that supported Chinese tourism involved sophisticated logistics and infrastructure specifically designed to accommodate large numbers of visitors from across the border. North Korean authorities had developed streamlined border crossing procedures at multiple entry points, including the primary crossing at Dandong-Sinuju that could process thousands of Chinese tourists daily during peak seasons. The regime invested heavily in Chinese language signage throughout major tourist areas and constructed currency exchange services optimized for renminbi transactions, making the experience seamless for visitors who often spoke no Korean. Chinese tour operators had established regular charter flight services between major Chinese cities and Pyongyang, creating reliable transportation infrastructure that made North Korean tourism accessible to middle-class Chinese families seeking unique international experiences. The tour packages typically lasted 3 to 5 days and included visits to major Pyongyang attractions, the demilitarized zone, and various cultural sites that showcased North Korean achievements, while carefully avoiding areas that might provide unflattering glimpses of daily life under the regime. These standardized tour routes generated predictable revenue streams that North Korean economic planners relied upon for foreign currency earnings, creating an economic model that assumed continued growth in Chinese visitor numbers year after year. The absence of Chinese tourists since early 2020 represents the single largest economic loss in North Korean tourism. History creating a financial void that no other visitor market can realistically fill. The $175 million in annual revenue from Chinese tourism exceeded the combined value of all other foreign currency sources available to North Korea under international sanctions, making Chinese visitors economically essential rather than simply beneficial. The regime's tourism infrastructure, employment systems, and foreign exchange planning all assumed continued Chinese visitor flows that have now been absent for over 5 years, with no clear timeline for resumption. China's reluctance to resume tourist travel to North Korea reflects complex concerns about information control and political stability that extend beyond simple pandemic-related travel restrictions. Chinese authorities understand that their citizens would return from North Korea with first-hand observations about economic conditions, social dynamics, and political developments that could contradict official Chinese narratives about their socialist neighbor. The Chinese government has historically maintained careful control over information about North Korea that reaches Chinese citizens, presenting the relationship in terms that support broader Chinese foreign policy objectives, while avoiding details that might create domestic political complications. Chinese social media platforms including Weibo, WeChat, and Douyin have evolved significantly since 2019, creating new challenges for controlling information flow from tourists returning from North Korea. These platforms now feature sophisticated translation capabilities, real-time sharing functions, and algorithmic distribution systems that could amplify content about North Korean conditions far beyond traditional travel communities. Chinese authorities likely recognize that modern social media would make it impossible to contain tourist observations within manageable channels, creating potential problems for domestic information control that weren't significant concerns during previous years of North Korean tourism. The infrastructure that North Korea built specifically for Chinese tourists now sits completely unused, representing billions of dollars in wasted investment that continues generating maintenance costs without producing any revenue. Hotels throughout Pyongyang featured Chinese television channels and shopping areas stocked with products appealing to Chinese consumer tastes, while the Wonsan-Kalma Beach Resort included Chinese-language entertainment programming and dining facilities designed around Chinese culinary preferences that made the complex particularly attractive to Chinese tour groups. Border infrastructure investments have become equally obsolete without Chinese tourist flows. North Korea expanded immigration facilities, constructed new customs processing areas, and built transportation connections specifically designed to handle the volume of Chinese visitors that exceeded 300,000 annually during peak years. These facilities require ongoing security, maintenance, and staffing costs despite processing virtually no tourist traffic, creating economic burdens that compound the loss of tourism revenue from absent Chinese visitors. The diplomatic implications of continued Chinese tourist absence extend beyond simple economic considerations into broader questions about the China-North Korea relationship and regional stability. Chinese tourism had served as a visible symbol of normalized relations between the two countries, demonstrating to international observers that North Korea maintained important economic partnerships despite international isolation. The continued absence of Chinese tourists suggests deeper concerns within Beijing about North Korea's current direction and the potential risks associated with closer engagement. Chinese government travel policies have become increasingly restrictive regarding North Korea specifically, even as other international travel restrictions have been relaxed or eliminated. Chinese citizens face bureaucratic obstacles when attempting to organize North Korean tours that didn't exist during the pre-pandemic period, suggesting deliberate policy decisions to discourage rather than simply regulate such travel. These restrictions appear designed to maintain distance from North Korean domestic developments, while avoiding the information control challenges that resumed tourism would create. The economic relationship that made Chinese tourism so valuable to North Korea cannot be easily replicated with visitors from other countries. Chinese tourists typically spent more money per visit than Western tourists, traveled in larger groups that generated economies of scale for North Korean service providers, and required less specialized infrastructure compared to visitors from other cultural backgrounds. The language barriers, cultural differences, and logistical complications involved in serving non-Chinese tourists make alternative visitor markets far less profitable, even when they can be attracted to North Korea. The massive economic void created by absent Chinese tourists represents a structural problem for North Korea's tourism industry that cannot be solved through alternative visitor markets or policy adjustments. The scale, spending patterns, and infrastructure requirements of Chinese tourism created an economic model that depended entirely on continued access to Chinese visitors who may never return in meaningful numbers. Yet the February 2025 experiment revealed that North Korea's problems with tourism extended far beyond missing Chinese visitors into fundamental misunderstandings about how the modern world actually works. The technology gap that exposed everything. The regime's isolation had left them operating with technological assumptions that were 5 years out of date. North Korean officials had developed their information control strategies during an era when tourists carried basic digital cameras and smartphones with limited capabilities, modest storage, and no real-time sharing functions. These earlier devices required tourists to physically connect to computers for uploading content, creating natural delay periods that gave authorities time to assess potential problems before information reached international audiences. The gap in Western tourism meant that regime officials had no experience managing visitors equipped with the revolutionary technology improvements that occurred during their isolation period. Modern smartphones represented a quantum leap in documentation technology that North Korean authorities completely failed to anticipate. Camera systems had evolved to capture clear images in virtually any lighting condition, while video recording capabilities now produced professional-grade footage with advanced stabilization that eliminated the shakiness that previously marked amateur recordings. Low-light performance improvements meant that tourists could document activities in dimly lit areas where earlier cameras would have produced unusable footage, expanding their ability to record in situations where the regime assumed documentation would be impossible. Storage capacity advances created another dimension of the documentation challenge that caught officials unprepared. Modern smartphones included massive internal storage with automatic cloud backups that meant tourists could record continuously throughout their entire visit without worrying about space limitations. This capability eliminated the need for tourists to delete content during their trips, meaning that North Korean authorities could no longer rely on storage restrictions to naturally limit documentation volume. GPS technology integration had become seamlessly embedded in smartphone cameras, automatically recording precise location data with every photo and video without requiring any action from tourists. This geotagging functionality meant that every piece of content created by visitors included metadata that could verify exact locations, times, and movement patterns throughout their stay. North Korean guides attempting to restrict photography in sensitive areas discovered that tourists could capture location-verified evidence of the restrictions themselves, creating documentation of what the regime was trying to hide simply through the act of prohibition. Real-time translation applications represented perhaps the most problematic technological advancement for North Korean information control efforts. These apps could instantly translate spoken Korean conversations, allowing tourists to understand discussions between guides and local officials that were never intended for foreign ears. The technology worked through speech recognition that could process conversations happening in the background of videos, meaning that tourists inadvertently recorded and translated sensitive communications without realizing the significance of what they were capturing. The instant upload capabilities of modern smartphones completely undermined North Korea's traditional approach to information control through device inspection and content review. Tourists could upload photos and videos to automatic cloud backups immediately after recording them, making confiscation of devices irrelevant to preventing information spread. Cellular data connections that somehow remained accessible in the Rason area meant that content was reaching international audiences before North Korean authorities realized it had been recorded, eliminating their ability to prevent problematic information from spreading. North Korean guides discovered that their traditional methods for restricting tourist photography had become completely ineffective against modern smartphone capabilities. Previous visitors using dedicated cameras had obvious equipment that guides could easily identify and monitor. But smartphones recording video could appear to be used for checking messages, navigation, or other innocent purposes. The devices could record continuously while displaying other applications on their screens, making it impossible for guides to determine when documentation was actually occurring. Attempts to implement technology restrictions during the February visit revealed the regime's fundamental misunderstanding of modern device capabilities. Guides instructed tourists to disable location services and avoid photographing certain areas. But these instructions proved unenforceable because the technology operated automatically in ways that tourists themselves might not fully understand. GPS tracking continued recording movement patterns even when tourists believed they had disabled location functions, creating comprehensive maps of restricted areas that North Korean authorities wanted to keep geographically vague. The device inspection protocol that North Korean authorities implemented during the February visit demonstrated their outdated assumptions about how modern smartphones stored and transmitted information. Officials examined devices looking for problematic photos and videos using methods that might have been effective for managing digital cameras from years earlier. But they failed to understand that content was automatically backing up to cloud services that made device-level inspection meaningless. Tourists could delete content from their phones to satisfy inspections while retaining complete copies in online storage that North Korean authorities could not access or control. Translation technology created information risks that extended far beyond simple conversation recording. Modern smartphones could translate text visible in photographs, meaning that tourists inadvertently documented Korean language signs, posters, and written materials that they could analyze later using image recognition software. This capability meant that official English translations provided by guides could be verified against actual Korean text, revealing instances where guides had misrepresented or sanitized information for foreign visitors. The most concerning technological revelation for North Korean authorities likely involved the discovery that tourists could communicate with local residents using real-time translation apps that facilitated conversations previously impossible due to language barriers. These interactions allowed tourists to gather information directly from North Korean citizens without requiring official interpreters, creating opportunities for uncontrolled information exchange that the regime's supervision protocols were designed to prevent. Social media integration had become so seamless that tourists could share content across multiple platforms simultaneously without conscious effort. Videos uploaded to one platform automatically generated optimized descriptions and thumbnails, while the same content simultaneously appeared on other platforms through account linking that tourists had configured years earlier. This automatic distribution meant that North Korean content reached far larger audiences across more platforms than either tourists or regime officials anticipated. The sophistication of modern smartphone cameras enabled tourists to capture details that would have required professional photography equipment just a few years earlier. Advanced photography capabilities could document small text on signs and documents, while improved zoom functions allowed clear recording of activities occurring at distances where earlier cameras would have produced unusable footage. These capabilities meant that tourists inadvertently documented information that North Korean authorities had assumed would be impossible to capture using consumer-level devices. The technology gap exposed during the February experiment has created a fundamental challenge that extends far beyond simple equipment upgrades. The regime now understands that their traditional information control methods cannot manage visitors equipped with technology that operates far beyond what their protocols were designed to address. This technological reality has forced North Korean leadership to confront difficult questions about whether tourism can ever be compatible with their security requirements, setting the stage for decisions that will determine future scenarios, and the tourism gamble. Several critical factors will determine whether North Korea can ever resolve its tourism dilemma, with two primary scenarios emerging as most likely over the next 5 years. If the Ukraine conflict continues indefinitely, North Korea's military cooperation with Russia will maintain the estimated $5.5 billion in annual revenue that makes tourism economically irrelevant. This scenario allows the regime to prioritize information security over foreign currency earnings without facing severe financial consequences, potentially keeping their borders closed to Western visitors for years to come. However, if the war ends through negotiated settlement or Russian defeat, North Korea will face immediate pressure to replace massive military revenue with alternative income sources, and tourism represents one of the few legal options available under current international sanctions. The economic mathematics of these scenarios create stark choices for Kim Jong-un's regime. Continued military revenue from Russia eliminates the financial incentive to risk information control problems that tourism inevitably creates. But it also maintains North Korea's dependence on a single partner whose own economic and political stability remains uncertain. The alternative scenario forces the regime to confront whether they can develop new methods for controlling tourist information flow that account for the technological challenges revealed during the February experiment. North Korean authorities are likely developing strategies that attempt to address the smartphone documentation problems that caught them unprepared. These might include mandatory surrender of all electronic devices at the border with government-provided replacement phones containing monitoring software and restricted connectivity. Tourists could face requirements to use controlled internet access points that automatically screen content before allowing uploads to social media platforms. More extreme measures might involve legally binding agreements with substantial financial penalties for sharing unauthorized content, though enforcing such agreements would prove difficult given North Korea's limited international legal reach. The fundamental question remains whether any available technology or restriction method can solve North Korea's information control problem. Modern smartphone capabilities continue advancing rapidly, with new features regularly providing enhanced documentation abilities, better translation services, and more sophisticated sharing options. The regime's restrictions would need constant evolution to match these developments, requiring substantial resources and expertise that may not be available given their technological isolation and limited access to cutting-edge surveillance equipment. Economic pressures within North Korea continue mounting as empty tourism infrastructure consumes millions of dollars annually in maintenance costs, while generating no revenue. The Wonsan Kalma Beach Resort and Samjian Ski Resort represent unsustainable financial drains that become increasingly difficult to justify as the facilities age without use. These economic realities might eventually force tourism reopening regardless of security concerns, particularly if military revenue from Russia decreases or domestic conditions deteriorate further. The regime might attempt limited tourism experiments with more restrictive parameters designed to prevent the information control problems that emerged in February. Future initiatives could involve shorter visit durations, smaller group sizes, or access limited to specially constructed facilities that provide no authentic glimpses of North Korean society. However, such restrictions would likely make the tourism experience so limited that few people would pay significant amounts to participate, reducing the economic benefits that justify the security risks. Changes in international relations could significantly impact tourism policy decisions. Different American administrations might take more diplomatic approaches that reduce regime concerns about intelligence gathering, potentially allowing broader access that includes U.S. citizens for the first time since travel restrictions were implemented. Conversely, increased tensions could make North Korean authorities even more restrictive about Western visitors, particularly those from countries with strong military alliances opposing North Korea's current partnerships. Other authoritarian regimes provide examples of attempting to balance tourism revenue with information control, though none face challenges as extreme as North Korea's situation. These countries generally use technological infrastructure and international cooperation that North Korea cannot access due to sanctions and isolation. The technological solutions that might theoretically address information control challenges would require capabilities that North Korea likely cannot develop or obtain. And even sophisticated systems would probably remain vulnerable to the same technological advances that made smartphone restrictions ineffective during the February experiment. The regime might also consider geographic solutions that limit tourists to border areas like Rason, while keeping them completely separated from the broader North Korean population. This approach could theoretically reduce information security risks while still generating some tourism revenue. But it would also limit the economic impact and appeal of North Korean tourism compared to more comprehensive access that visitors typically expect from international destinations. International sanctions create additional complications for any tourism expansion, as many potential revenue-generating activities remain prohibited under current restrictions. The regime cannot easily market North Korean tourism through normal international channels, accept standard payment methods, or provide the types of amenities that modern tourists expect without violating various sanctions regimes. These limitations reduce both the potential profitability of tourism and the regime's ability to compete with other destinations for international visitors. The infrastructure investments that North Korea has made in anticipation of tourism resumption create mounting pressure for some form of economic return. Billions of dollars in resort complexes, transportation systems, and supporting facilities represent sunk costs that generate no revenue while requiring ongoing maintenance expenses. The longer these facilities remain unused, the more difficult it becomes to justify their construction, and the greater the pressure becomes to find ways to utilize them despite security concerns. The fundamental contradiction between tourism revenue and regime security creates a permanent tension where meaningful tourism opening threatens political stability while continued isolation prevents economic development. This contradiction appears impossible to resolve under North Korea's current political system, where tourism inherently involves foreign contact and information exchange that conflicts with the isolation necessary for maintaining authoritarian control. The regime faces an impossible choice between economic development and information control, with no clear path forward that satisfies both requirements simultaneously. The February experiment ultimately exposed deeper systemic contradictions between North Korea's economic needs and authoritarian governance that extend far beyond simple tourism policy. The 13 Western visitors who documented their trip generated over 15 million combined views across social media platforms, demonstrating that traditional information control methods cannot manage contemporary technology where every smartphone functions as a broadcasting studio capable of reaching millions of viewers within hours. With ongoing isolation, billions in tourism infrastructure sit idle, creating mounting maintenance costs and testing the regime's willingness to maintain control over potential revenue streams. The regime now confronts whether desperately needed foreign currency justifies the information security risks that modern tourism inevitably creates. Can the hermit kingdom ever unlock its gates in the digital era, or has the smartphone already done the open